Okay, to start this new unit off, we're going to talk about the ideas of absolutism and enlightenment. But first, just to start off, we're going to start in the year 1600, which is a little over 400 years ago. Now, why 1600? There's a lot of reasons why this specific date is important and why this is the real start of modern world history. First and foremost, where's my little pointer here? You can see here the year 1600 is about right here. Now, this is a graph of world population growth through history. So this is just a measure of how many people there are in the world in billions. Now, you can see for most of human history, there are way over 1 billion people in the world, a really small number, maybe a few hundred million. And it grows slowly and slowly and slowly. And right about where we start this story, the number of people in the world explodes. Looking at it now, this is roughly in 2020. We're at over 7 billion people today. So over only a couple hundred years, we're getting from 1 billion people to over 7 billion, even though for all of human history, it was much, 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 much smaller than that. And understanding why that happens is really critical to our story. Most of us, if the events we will talk about hadn't happened, we wouldn't exist. The population would still be really, really small. This graph shows the economic history of the world. The bigger the color, the more share of the world economy that country provides. So think of this as a way of measuring the size of our economy, about how rich people are in a nation. There we can see the red is China and the orange here is India. And for most of history, they had the two biggest economies in the world. But just after the start time of 1600, they start getting smaller and smaller and smaller, with countries such as Russia, Germany, Italy, Spain, the UK, and France getting much, much larger, as well as the United States. So a big part of our story is why these nations, most of them in Europe or in America, got so much more powerful than the countries that had previously been really powerful, like China and India. Now, here's a map of the world in the year 1600. As you can see, it's a little different than most maps of the world today. But you can see there are many white areas of the world and these are areas that didn't really have a government, so to speak. Oftentimes, they were just kind of like random small tribes, rather than being an actual country. People would live in like these little tribes of maybe 100 people at most, and they didn't have any kind of centralized government like we did today. Like we live in the United States today. Much of the United States, which is over here, there wasn't really any kind of country controlling it. You can kind of see there's a lot of empires that are around that are really big. The Russian Empire, the Qing Empire, this is China over here, the Mughal Empire, which controlled India, and the Ottoman Empire, which controlled a lot of the Middle East. Another thing to note here is that many of the areas in what is now America and Mexico and Brazil, these are controlled by European countries. Much of the East Coast, such as where New York City is, was controlled by England. The blue here, which is now Canada, was controlled by France. All this green stuff was owned by the country of Spain. And this green here is controlled by Portugal. It would eventually become Brazil. So a lot of what is now North America and South America was controlled by European countries. Here's a map of Europe itself, and we're going to be talking a lot about Europe because many of the big changes in the world happened here. Now, there are some pretty similar names going on. We got France over here, Spain's over here, we got England and Scotland, and those are really familiar. We also have a lot of names that might not be familiar. You got the Ottoman Empire over here that no longer exists. There's Poland, Lithuania, which is this big blue blob. There's Muscovy, which is, that doesn't quite exist today either. And you can kind of see in the middle here, where today Germany is just a big mess of tiny little countries. This is known as the Holy Roman Empire. It was a bunch of kind of countries that are all on their own and kind of controlled by the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, most people at this time looked roughly like this. They were peasants or serfs, which are kind of just a small step above being slaves. They worked their entire lives for the benefit of their rulers, and they lived in great poverty, often suffering from wars and famines and diseases. This is what a typical house would look like, and it varied depending on the part of the world you're in, but most people lived in a house that was kind of like this. It might be like a stone or a wall made of mud. The roof was made of straw. This would be like the bed. It was typically one big room. It was almost like a combination of a kitchen. You cooked your food over here. You had your bedroom over here. You kind of hung out over here next to this one table. And there's also a barn. These people were farmers. They kept their animals with them. They lived in the same house as the people. They didn't have enough money to be able to afford a separate building for a barn for the animals, as well as they couldn't afford separate rooms. Everything had to be in the same room. So it was really, really cramped, especially when you think that these peasants over here would have, between 5 and 10 children per family. So this would be a very, very crowded space. They had a lot of children because they weren't sure how many would survive. It was really common for people to die when they were babies, from disease, or they just weren't taken care of. So you could have 10 kids, but only 5 of them would make it to being adults. Europe and much of the rest of the world was ruled under an idea called feudalism. So it's kind of an exchange of loyalty between members of a society. So at the bottom here, these are the peasants, the serfs. Their lives were brutish, they're miserable, and they're very short. They're kind of the real bottom tier. Now, the next tier up were knights. Now, knights, in theory, offered protection to the peasants. That kind of varied. A lot of the time, they wouldn't provide protection. A lot of the time, the knight's job was to bully the peasants if the peasants were like hiding food from the knights. Next up are the lords. These guys, like each of the lords, has some knights under his command, and they would basically be kind of his warriors or thugs to beat up either his own peasants or other lords' peasants. And at the very top was the king, who in theory controlled and was in charge of all the lords and controlled everyone below him. However, the lords, if they thought the king wasn't doing a good job, or if the king, was taxing him too much, or whatever it may be, would absolutely overthrow the king and make one of them the king. This happened all the time. The governments didn't last very long because everyone was always overthrowing their king. There's also the idea of colonialism. This is the idea. Colonialism is going to other countries and taking them over. European countries began to rapidly take over and settle their people in the Americas, in North and South America. They also made a lot of trade networks, trading goods in Africa and Asia. They wanted a lot of these really desirable goods that they couldn't grow in Europe or didn't have in Europe. The examples were gold and silver. Europeans had already mined all their gold and silver, and they were getting it from other countries. Sugar at this time could only be grown in tropical regions. Europe's pretty cold most of the year. They couldn't do this. Tobacco was another big one. Tobacco, again, can only be grown in like hot climates, and it could best be grown in like the United States. What is now Virginia was a big tobacco place. Coffee was another one that could only be grown in hot climates, so they had to go abroad to get it. And these two, spices and silk, could only be found in parts of Asia, near China and Japan and Vietnam today. At the time, even though these are both pretty cheap nowadays, they were worth their weight in gold at the time. Even really common spices like cinnamon, pepper, chili peppers, things like that were, again, worth their weight in gold because they were so rare and valuable. Even salt was extremely rare and valuable. So this is the map of North America and South America in the year 1600. Actually, I think this is 1700, but still pretty close. As you can see, all these colored areas are areas ruled by European countries. All the purple is ruled by Spain. Much of what is now the United States was owned by Spain. The blue is owned by France, so a lot of the middle part of the United States, which is right here. And the green is ruled by England and Great Britain. So a lot of Canada and a lot of America too. The orange here is owned by Portugal. So by this time, most of the Americas were owned by European countries, and they were actively trying to get rid of the Native Americans that called this place home. In addition, Europe is over here. The Americas would be over here to the left. Europeans, they're trying to get these valuable goods, these spices and silks and stuff like that. They could only be found over here in Asia. So they had to go on boats and try to travel all the way around Africa to get to these goods that they wanted to get. For example, in China would trade silks, drugs like medicines, perfume, and porcelain. Porcelain's what like fine china is made of, which was really rare at the time and hard to make. Also what toilets are made of. They didn't have it in Europe. India had spices and cotton. Most of our clothes today are made of cotton. And precious stones like jewels and diamonds, as well as sugar. And over here there were a lot of other spices. Many of the spices at this time, like again, pepper, chilies, cinnamon, could only be grown on a couple tiny little islands throughout here. For example, this island here, known as the Spice Islands, at one time, all of the pepper in the entire world was grown on this little bunch of islands right here. And it had to make its way all the way across all of this to get to Europe, where it was bought. And Europeans, as they're sailing their boats over here, would slowly take over cities, take over land to have bases for their boats so they could trade. At the same time, as they're traveling and doing all this stuff, they're learning what's over here. They didn't necessarily know where these things were coming from. They knew China kind of existed, but they didn't know, oh, it's right here in this place, and this is what these people are like. It was only legends before. There's also the matter of what's known as the Columbian Exchange. Now, as most of you could probably expect, plants and animals cannot swim across the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, there are a lot of different plants and animals between North America and South America, and between Europe and Africa and Asia. When Europeans started going over to the Americas and started, taking it over, they found a lot of plants and animals that were super useful and super great. And they brought a lot of their own plants and animals along as well. Some animals or some plants that were only found in North America were things we eat all the time today, like tomatoes, corn, beans, potatoes, peppers, squash. Nobody really eats squash. Turkeys are another big one. Tobacco as well. Even like pumpkins, they were all from the Americas. And these crops were really good at helping grow more food. The potato as well is really helped double Europe's population in the 100 years after this. In addition, the Europeans brought a lot of stuff to North and South America, like coffee. They brought a lot of fruits like oranges and limes, peaches and pears, bananas, honeybees, wheat, rice, onions. They brought a lot of livestock like cows, sheep, pigs, and horses. They also brought a lot of diseases such as smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough. These diseases would eventually kill over 90% of all Native Americans on these two continents. So there were a lot of consequences of this early colonialism. One, Europeans became very wealthy from going out and taking over all this other land. The new crops, again, helped the Europeans grow their population by growing more food. China would end up collapsing. India would also end up going through a really rough time because of Europeans coming in and taking over stuff. And Europeans would only want to go and take over more stuff. They were getting rich and they wanted even more stuff. They only had a greater appetite for colonialism. It's also worth mentioning at this time, this is the start of the transatlantic slave trade, where over a couple hundred years, from 1500s to 1860s, hundreds of or millions of slaves were transported from the continent of Africa here, where they were bought, to spots in the Americas. As you can see, the biggest ones were Brazil, where over 4 million slaves were brought, and to the Caribbean, such as Cuba and Haiti and Jamaica, where other millions were brought. The United States, even though today we have a very large black population, that was kind of a small spot. Not that many slaves in the grand scheme of things were brought to the United States. However, the slavery in the United States was, as horrible as it was, often was in some ways better than these other regions. In these other regions, they were farming things like sugarcane, which was really, really hard to work. Many millions, I should say, of slaves were worked to death in these areas. Where in the United States, it was generally farming things like tobacco, which was a bit easier. Not as many slaves died. So that wraps it up for this. I have a short little quiz below this assignment. Please complete that.